Good afternoon. Welcome to our public policy session. Full disclosure, we had been working for some time to get Senator Franken to come join us today, and we thought we might have the opportunity to have him. He told us at the last minute he was unable to come. You also have a very nice letter from him in your packets. Usually when senators say, oh, we're back in session, you think, oh, they're just back in the office doing a few things. You may notice there's a fairly important vote coming up in the Senate this week about the Supreme Court justice. And it looks like the possibility that Democrats might have 41 votes, potentially including Senator Franken, so he's actually probably doing something for real this week. Since November, we've been asked a lot in the AACRAO office to come out and talk to people about what's different between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And we've thought, well, besides everything, you mean more specifically? I was thinking of the Calvin and Hobbes, one of my favorite Calvin and Hobbes cartoons. Any Calvin and Hobbes fans in the house? Where Calvin is sitting with Hobbes under the tree and reflecting that, isn't it weird that day by day nothing seems to change, but after a while, all of a sudden everything's different? Well, with the Trump administration, day by day, everything seems to change. You know, based on a 5:30 a.m. tweet, we may see something different from the conversation from the day before. So in thinking through who might actually be able to think about what's truly different, we couldn't think of anybody better to join us in that conversation today than Scott Jaschik from Inside Higher Ed. Let me set up a little bit about him and what we're going to do here today. Scott Jaschik is the editor and one of the three founders of Inside Higher Ed. He leads the editorial operations of Inside Higher Ed, oversees news content, opinion pieces, career advice, blogs, and other features. He's a leading voice on higher education issues, quoted regularly in publications nationwide and publishing articles on colleges in such places as the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Washington Post, Salon, and elsewhere. He has been a judge or screener for the National Magazine Awards, the Online Journalism Awards, Folio Editorial Excellence Awards, and the Education Writers Association Awards. He served as a mentor in the Community College Fellowship Program for the Hechinger Institute on Education in the Media of the Teachers College of Columbia University, and he's a member of the Board of Education Writers Association. Now, I'm a news junkie, and after I have my coffee every morning, the first thing I honestly do is open up Inside Higher Ed. I love reading Scott's work, the work that Paul Fain does. We've seen Paul Fain join us here, his work on community colleges and innovation in higher education, competency-based education. Carl Stromshine, doing great work on technology, has done, recently interviewed Leroy Rooker, you've heard of him, about FERPA and some things. Great piece that he did on our Comprehensive Student Record Project. Elizabeth Redden on your staff doing tremendous work on international education issues, so it's a tremendous resource for us. So we're going to have an opportunity to hear Scott talk about some of his insights, and as soon as he's done, he's going to have a conversation with our new Director of Government Relations, William Gill. William's been with us about 6 weeks now, brings a tremendous amount of experience to us, having been a staffer for several congressional members, quite a few years doing government relations with HACU, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, and most recently on the staff of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. So we're really pleased to have him. And to start off, we're going to do our more traditional federal update, and you each week from our surveys of our members that you enjoy receiving your copy of the transcript. The transcript is our way of helping keep you informed, and the editor of that is Michelle Mott, and she's going to start us off with the federal update. Please welcome Michelle.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. My goal today is basically to provide you with a few AACRAO government relations updates and then a very broad overview of what's been going on in higher education at the federal level. This will hopefully give you kind of a quick primer for the discussion between our esteemed presenters a little later. As you do know, we have a new Director of Government Relations, and William he's hit the ground running, meeting with over 25 congressional offices already, focusing on the House and Senate members of the Education Committees and the Higher Ed subcommittees in particular, to discuss AACRAO's legislative priorities for the new Congress. The Government Relations Office has been working on developing a synthesized version of the association's Public Policy and Education Agenda, which is the document that you may have received walking in today. It outlines policy positions on key topics and our recommendations for legislative action on the Hill. You can also find a copy of this brief under the Files and Links section of this session within the AACRAO Engage app, so if you'd like to take a look at that later. In another effort to help guide our responses to emerging issues, we recently reestablished the AACRAO Public Policy Advisory Group. There was a great response for our call for interested members this past fall, and we're very excited to begin our work with this group that was chosen to serve for the next 3 years. Will those group members in attendance please stand? Thank you. This group will be chaired by veteran PPAC member Tim Amex, and they will provide an essential practitioner perspective on emerging legislation and policy matters and serve as a practical resource as we engage on proposed legislation and regulations. So thank you. The Trump administration has been eventful. However, the president's views on higher education have been largely short on details thus far. So we're not exactly sure what's coming down the pike. What do we know? Trump's budget requests for both the 2017 and 18 fiscal years do give us some indication of his plans for education, and we'll dig more into that in a little bit. Another thing that we do know, sort of, is that President Trump has asked Liberty University President Jerry Falwell Jr. to lead a task force on higher education regulation that will identify changes to the department's policies and procedures, according to Falwell. Neither the department nor the administration has actually confirmed this statement, though, so we're not sure on the status of that task force. In the new Congress, Republicans maintain control of both the House and the Senate. Senator Lamar Alexander remained as the chair, and Patty Murray, the ranking member of the Chamber's Education Committee. On the House side, Congresswoman Virginia Fox, wrong animal. Pardon. Whew, Freudian slip perhaps, sorry. Virginia Fox became chair of the Ed and Workforce Committee, replacing retiring John Klein from Minnesota. Congressman Bobby Scott from Virginia returned as the top Democrat on the panel. Leaders of both parties in both houses have said that the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act will be a top priority in this Congress and will provide an opportunity to tackle a host of policy issues affecting higher ed. Based on conversations on and around the Hill, Congress will hopefully start work later this year or early next year on the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, with the Trump administration giving scant attention to higher education issues. Thus far, we do assume that most of the higher ed work will be driven through Congress and through discussions relating to reauthorization. Mike and other higher ed leaders previously met with Senator Alexander to discuss reauthorization and where there might be bipartisan agreement and where there might be differences on specific higher ed policies, and these are still expected to guide the process moving forward. Areas where there's agreement, FAFSA simplification, prior, year-round Pell, streamlining loan repayment. Areas where there's some agreement, but we still need more work, campus safety, risk sharing, accreditation reform, data collection, and the question of a federal unit record data system. Areas where there is considerable disagreement, and likely these will be addressed through floor amendments, loan interest rates, community college, free community college, mandatory Pell, and a number of other issues. and we will keep you posted as Congress moves forward in this process. The federal budget. We'll start with a quick update on the 2017 fiscal year budget. Yes, we are still talking about the 2017 fiscal year budget, but that means that this year we'll get the threat of 2 potential federal government shutdowns, which is always fun. The continuing resolution currently funding the government expires at the end of this month. Congress is currently working to cobble together some sort of catch-all package to fund the government through the end of October. Late last week, the administration made an 11th hour request for nearly $18 billion in spending cuts to education, research, and other domestic discretionary programs. Although at this stage in the budget process, Congress is not likely to incorporate them. Lawmakers are also gearing up for spending bills for the 2018 fiscal year. Trump recently submitted his blueprint for the fiscal year 2018, which included deep cuts to education and research programs, slashing the education budget by nearly 13%, and targeting federal financial aid programs in particular. The president's call for such a radical shakeup in discretionary spending pleased basically no one. Even Republican appropriators have deemed the proposed cuts to non-defense programs dead on arrival. And Democratic leaders have warned that any increase in defense spending must be paired with an equivalent increase in non-defense spending. So all signs are pointed to a contentious appropriations process once again this fall. Okay, to cap off this very broad overview, we want to touch on a few trending topics, beginning with the Trump administration's travel ban. This issue has created a lot of confusion and concern for institutions across the country. The second revised iteration of the order is currently stuck in legal limbo. The latest ban does not apply to lawful permanent residents or to those with valid visas, including student exchange visas. But we're still seeing disruption to current students and scholars from the affected countries. There are also lingering issues and concerns for how it will impact new international enrollments and American higher education's continued ability to attract top talent from abroad. President Trump has so far left intact the Deferred Action Program for childhood arrivals. However, the future of this program is still uncertain. Trump and Republican leaders in Congress have said that they're working on a plan to address the status of DACA recipients. Neither have disclosed details on their discussions, though, and although both have suggested that those currently protected under the program would not face immediate deportation. As you've probably heard or seen, AACRAO recently conducted a survey which found that nearly 40% of U.S. colleges are seeing a decline in applications from international students. Also, international student recruitment professionals report a great deal of concern from students and their families about visas and perceptions of a less welcoming climate here in the U.S. A full report on the results with more details scheduled to be released in the next few days, so look for that. Regulatory retrenchment. The administration and the Republican-led Congress have stated that deregulation is a priority, and we've already seen this in action. In February, Congress passed 2 measures blocking the administration's regulations governing teacher prep and accountability provisions under ESSA. We anticipate additional movement on state authorization of online programs and borrower defense to repayment next, but gainful employment is also likely on the chopping block. The administration also recently rescinded Obama-era guidance to protect transgender students. The previous guidance cited Title IX as the basis for requiring institutions to allow transgender students to use facilities that align with their gender identity. This now leaves it basically up to the courts to determine whether Title IX's prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sex, whether that extends to gender identity. A federal appeals court has yet to do that, and the issue is currently being litigated in other courts across the country. AACRAO's commitment to support transgender students preceded the Obama administration's 2016 guidance, though, and the association recently established a student identity work group to develop guidance for AACRAO members and their institutions on serving transgender students. The group has been working diligently and is aiming to issue final recommendations this fall. AACRAO established another work group on transcript disciplinary notations in April 2015, based on growing interest by AACRAO members, as well as new and proposed state and federal legislation. The group was charged with developing guidance regarding the use of disciplinary notations on transcripts for students that are considering the practice or that are required to do so by law. The work group draft guidance is now complete and was open to the membership for review last month, and final recommendations are expected to be released in May. So hopefully this gives you a little background on some of the big issues impacting higher ed and AACRAO's general work on that. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Scott Jaschik. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and Mike, when he noted the number of my colleagues who write about these issues, basically every one of them is pestering AACRAO staff members and AACRAO members, and I am so grateful for the expertise that you all share and the examples you all share of important work that you're doing. I need to confess before starting that this isn't a happy talk I'm giving. These are very challenging times. And if I were to just give you good news, I wouldn't be fulfilling my obligation to tell you what's going on. I agree, of course, with everything we just heard about what's going on in the federal scene that would affect you, but I've organized a top 10 list around the idea of 10 shifts that are going on. Some of them are policy shifts, like you just heard about. Some of them are more philosophical. And I think it's important, as we in higher education consider what's going on in the world, to pay attention both to the policies and also the underlying philosophies, as they're going to come back again and again. So let me dive in. Number one is the budget. And I think the budget is very important because ever since Election Day, we've been writing stories saying college officials fear the Trump administration will do, and then fill in the blanks. The budget is an actual document of actual policies. And it, among other things, as you just heard, would cut SEOG, would kill the SEOG program, cut work study, cut TRIO. By raiding the so-called surplus fund, in effect, will cut Pell, and I think make it impossible to restore year-round Pell. And also cut and eliminate AmeriCorps, which has been an important way for many people to pay for college. What do these things all have in common? They all serve disadvantaged low-income students. SEOG, most recipients are from families of income below $30,000. This is not a budget that protects low-income students. And it's important to be clear about all these programs that really matter. I also think it's particularly important in light of photo opportunities we've seen in recent weeks, claiming to show how much the administration loves historically black colleges, that these are all cuts that would disproportionately affect minority students, both those attending minority serving institutions and other institutions. That's who's getting cut. Issue number two would be the arrival at the same time of a Republican president and a very fiscally conservative Congress. I don't think people realize the full impact of the combination, and you need to think back about all the things that various Congresses would have done but for the threat of a veto, or things that presidents would have done but for the threat of rejection in Congress. We have a very different situation right now. And while it's true, as you just heard, that many of the proposed cuts are in programs that many Republicans like. I mean, when you think work study, what could be a more politically safe program? But the reality is that if the Republicans in Congress choose to put tax cuts, military increases, and building a wall as their top priorities, they will make big cuts. And I don't know which of the proposals will go through and which won't, but I think there's a good chance some will go through. Issue three, a philosophical shift away from the idea that more students need to go to college. One of the historic things about the Obama administration was that President Obama and Michelle Obama talked over and over and over again in efforts, in some cases involving AACRAO, about the need for everyone to get some college training, some college education. This is a radical shift from the past presidents of the United States, who tended to focus more on helping those who were already going to college pay for college. Obama said we need more people in the pool. That's a dramatic shift, and it's a shift that means more attention for the disadvantaged in our society. Today, I am not hearing the administration talk about the need for more people to go to college. We did an interview with Virginia Fox, whose name I'm now going to get wrong. I had to really watch myself there. We did an interview with Virginia Fox right after the election, and one of the questions we asked her was, what is the federal role to encourage more people to go to college? Her answer, what federal role? Think about that. We are in new times. And then look at where the cuts are being made. SEOG, Pell, work study. These are the programs on which people who wouldn't go to college can afford to go to college. And that's what's on the chopping block. Issue 4, a shift in public policy about how to improve the economy away from education. Look what we've seen in the past few weeks. A lot of talk about how we're going to bring back big factory jobs. A lot of talk about how all that we need to restore the auto industry is to eliminate regulations that require automakers to do less in the area of pollution. I actually don't believe that these things will improve the American economy. I don't believe we're going to see a return to the 1950s factory jobs. But we're talking about that, not about the need for more people to have more education and more skills. That is a message that's going out to people about what really is holding them back. Issue 5, travel bans and international students. I think it's important to note that this is not just about the countries that were affected by the first and second ban. Those bans sent messages all over the world. AACRAO's research has been very helpful to us in understanding exactly what the trends are. We decided to do some of our own reporting on where are the applicants going. And so we just did a big story on Canada. Do you know that the University of Waterloo has international applications, meaning from outside Canada, up 25%. At the University of Toronto, applications from India are up 59%. Applications from the United States are up 80%. Think about that for a minute. McGill University, historically the top Canadian university in terms of attracting American applicants, US applications up 22%, India up 54%. As we look at this international issue and continue to rely on your good data, it is very important to remember we have competition. In the post-World War II era, when the top international talent shifted from Britain to the US, we were the only player in the world. Canada wants them now. Australia wants them. New Zealand wants them. And those countries have great universities. Britain is actually going more like us and becoming more hostile. But the reality is these students have options. And while all of you in this room, I believe, value international students for the educational merit and value that they bring to the US, some of your colleagues at your colleges probably are also aware of the full pay revenue that these students bring. This is going to be not just an educational problem, but an economic problem for many colleges. Now, issue 6, I want to go philosophical on this. During his post-election, pre-inauguration Thank You America tour, President Trump gave a talk in Ohio in which he said, "There are no global citizens." I would urge all of you to look at your institutional mission statements, and I suspect many of you will find that your mission is to train global citizens. Think about this. American colleges send students abroad, recruit students abroad, do research with faculty from all over the world. The identity of American higher education is indeed an international identity. I saw a map out there over in the bookstore where people were noting all the countries that are represented at this conference, and that is American higher education. To be told that we must take America first is a dramatic challenge to American higher education. Issue 7, diversity in society and whether it is valued. This organization's members have a very strong historic commitment to serving the disadvantaged, to serving the marginalized populations, and making them feel included. While I don't doubt that you will continue that work, the reality is it's much harder when there is not a commitment on the top, when people aren't hearing from their lawmakers that this matters. We are in such a period, and we're reporting on campus after campus where there are ugly racial incidents. White nationalists are more active on campus today than ever in history. These are difficult, challenging times. Issue 8, dissent and free speech. There is a lot of people, many people are accusing colleges because of a recent event at Middlebury College of being unwilling to hear ideas with which they disagree. Now, I think that incident was overblown, and in fact, there is free exchange of ideas on most campuses everywhere. But what this points out is that higher education is a very convenient source to attack when people on the right want to pretend that they like higher education, but for alleged political correctness. Higher ed does have some issues with some people being unwilling to hear other sides. I think that's on both the left and the right, but this is an issue I would expect to see more and more scrutiny. Issue 9, the undocumented students. And here again, the big surprise is that nothing has changed yet. I think this may actually point to some interesting potential in that it appears that President Trump was moved by stories he heard of dream students and was somehow reluctant to do what he promised to do. Whether that will stay the course of time, I don't know, but it's an interesting example to think about. Final issue I want to mention is debt and debt-free college. This continues to be an issue. And many people thought that the debt-free or free public higher education idea might die with the presidential election. In fact, it's very much alive right now in New York State with a plan from Governor Cuomo. The governor of Rhode Island has proposed a plan. There's legislation in Massachusetts and California and elsewhere. It's not national and it's on the state level, but debt remains to be a hot issue and these plans remain a hot issue. I want to close by sharing something that happened to Inside Higher Ed that I think points to the challenges I face as a journalist and you face as educators today. We ran an article about 2 months ago about mumps outbreak on campus. I thought it would be a very non-controversial article. I have a dashboard on my desktop and I watch the traffic on articles all day long. And in the afternoon, the mumps article was surging. And so I tried to figure out why, because I didn't think there was a controversy. All the traffic was coming from the Drudge Report, which linked to our article. And then I looked at the comments that were coming in from the people who came to us from the Drudge Report. The comments, which I quickly killed, were all variations of illegals bring disease, build the wall. Now, I was stunned. I didn't even know that this was a thing in the anti-immigrant world, but evidently it is. It's not true, of course. The irony is that our story about the mumps outbreak was about an outbreak that started at Harvard, Yale, Wellesley, and Bowdoin College. You know, the places that Mexicans go to as soon as they get into the United States. But what this example to me shows is that we in the higher ed press and you in higher education face more scrutiny, much of it from people who don't share values of inclusivity, of diversity, of education, than ever before. And people are watching, and they're saying things, and they're posting things like that result in a lot of hate email for me, and no doubt tough questions for many of you. I think I resolve at Inside Higher Ed that we will continue to cover these issues, and I urge you to continue your commitments even if the current realities in higher education make them all the more challenging. So now Bill will join me and we'll be talking about these issues. Thank you very much.
Scott, congratulations. Thank you so much. Can you give him another round of applause for his insights? I like to say out of chaos comes opportunity, and we're certainly going to have a lot of opportunity in this, with this presidency. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is William Gill. As Mike mentioned, I'm the new Director of Government Relations here for AACRAO. I lead the team that's responsible for getting all of your issues. Again, these are your issues in front of Congress and administration. It truly is a great honor, responsibility, and one that the entire AACRAO Government Relations team takes very, very seriously. So thank you very much. All right, let's move along. Scott, we certainly have a lot to talk about. Let's jump straight into budgets, all right? Let's talk about the 2017 and 2018. As Michelle mentioned, there's a continuing resolution. It's up at April 28th. Seems that's a long time. But realistically, Congress really only has 4 working days before we are in the edge of a government shutdown. Why 4 working days? They're going to be talking about the Supreme Court nomination this week. They go on break for 2 weeks. They come back on April the 24th. That gives them 4 days to figure this out. You guys are very confident that this is going to be taken care of, right? 4 days. Attached to it, complicating, is what was mentioned was a supplemental budget request of $33 billion for increased military spending, as well as funding to help build the wall. And the way they're going to pay for these is through Pell Grant surplus reductions and NIH, just to name a few. Scott, what are your thoughts about how the president proposes to pay for this, and what do you think will be the final outcome for this 2017 budget?
So I think for both 2017 and 2018, we're going to see some real cuts. I don't think that enough congressional leaders care more about these programs than they do about tax cuts and the military. The other challenge here, I think, for people who are education advocates, is that by proposing so many different cuts, it's a whack-a-mole game. And Congress, the defenders of education, and the advocates are going to have a tough time fighting everything. I didn't even talk about, say, the NIH budget cuts, right, which to many university presidents may be more scary than some of the other things. I also think it was very politically shrewd to at least make the claim that Pell is being protected, because more people know Pell than, say, SEOG, which has a long name and an acronym people outside of this room don't know. That makes it more vulnerable, even though, frankly, its recipients are more vulnerable among students.
So picking up on the budget thread, now let's move to the 2018. We saw some numbers, and I just want to make sure that everybody really sees these numbers. It's a proposed reduction of $54 billion in discretionary spending, specifically $9.2 billion to the Department of Education. And some of these programs, we're not talking just chump change. We're talking $3.9 billion in Pell Grant reduction, $193 million in TRIO and Gear Up, $732 million with the abolishment of the Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant Program, reduced federal work study. We heard it was significant, but now we've heard recently that it's going to be approximately 50%, and research is absolutely going to be impacted. NIH funding is down by $5.8 billion. Scott, I know you mentioned that we are going to see some funding, but how do we as an organization, we as individuals, become engaged in this process? I mean, we all are very much committed and have a vested interest in a lot of these programs. They impact our students. But how do we get involved?
So the easy part, I think, is making the case for why these programs make a difference. I think many people in this room could point to examples on their campuses of why these programs matter. I think the more difficult challenge is getting involved in the broader fiscal debate. If you accept the premise of tax cuts and military spending increases, then these programs, or some of them, will be cut. And I think what education has historically done is only engaged in talking about education and not talking about the broader questions of priorities for our country and the willingness of people to be taxed or not taxed. I think engagement will be necessary outside of purely educational topics, or I fear that you will lose.
And just so everybody knows, AACRAO has been involved with other higher education associations. We've already, there's a letter circulating already about the 2017 budget and a 2018 budget, and all the higher education associations are very much in favor of maintaining and supporting. So as this discussion and this debate continues, know that we will be calling on all of you to become engaged, because only collectively will we have an impact. I mentioned this is a quintessential Washington, D.C. budget, right? Tell them that you're going to get cuts and make them spend all their energy to maintain the same level, and that's a win, right?
Yeah, well, look, the historically black colleges are saying it was a win for that photo op because minority-serving institutions aren't being cut. Well, again, that ignores the fact that the cuts will disproportionately hurt minority students.
So moving on a little bit, let's talk about ATA reauthorization. Some of the things that we've heard include simplification of the FAFSA, college affordability, students feeling priced out. I know that's a huge issue with Congresswoman Susan Davis, the ranking member of the House Higher Ed Subcommittee. Student debt, college readiness is another issue, obviously, attrition rates. What do you think is going to move and kind of be addressed?
Well, I agree with AACRAO's analysis that this is going to mostly come from the Hill, not from the Trump administration. And my sense is that most people in higher ed are sort of hoping that more of it comes from Lamar Alexander than from the House side. But that said, I'm not sure a lot of real change is going to be possible. You're going to hear a lot of talk about probably about 3-year college degrees, because Senator Alexander has always been very excited by that. I don't need to tell the registrars in this audience that most students aren't graduating in 4, so the idea of 3 probably, it's great for those who can do it, but it's not going to happen. College affordability, most students go to public institutions. Public institutions depend on state appropriations. It's absolutely true that it's not just money, but in states that aren't providing appropriate levels of support to their colleges, it's going to be very hard for tuition not to go up or to avoid gimmicks. Real change requires actual money and sustained effort.
So as we continue with this conversation, I just want to start letting everybody know, start thinking about some possible questions. As you guys will see, we have some mics lined up in the aisles, and we'll hopefully get some 5-10 minutes at the end where folks can come up and provide some questions. So next I want to bring up is regulations. We hear this is going to be the administration of deregulation, right? It's going to change everything. We've heard that. So I want to follow that. I want to talk about Jerry Falwell Jr., the president of Liberty University, as mentioned before. He's going to lead the higher education task force for the administration. As I read about it, the goal of the task force would be to, quote, bring a focus on overregulation and micromanagement of higher education. Tell us your thoughts about the commission or the task force,
Sure.
as well as kind of regulations in general.
So since the election, if college leaders have been trying to come up with the good news, they'll say, well, at least the new Trump administration is going to be anti-regulation. And they're excited by that because nobody likes regulation. My fear, based on covering higher education for far too long, is that everyone says they're against regulation, but I actually believe most lawmakers are against any regulation they didn't write. And in fact, we've already seen bills introduced by Trump allies in Congress that would require colleges to say, file reports every year about why their tuition increase isn't smaller, to file reports about perks for their presidents, to file reports about spending on various items. There's no legislation that I know of requiring them to report on perks for admissions and registrar people. I'm assuming because there's not enough perks being given. But I throw that out as an example just to show that regulation happens because the party in power wants certain things. And in higher education, because higher education is decentralized, the way you get those things is you require colleges to fill out reports. So I think we'll see regulatory change. Some regulation will go away, others will come back, but I'm not sure we're going to see this great era of deregulation. The other thing that's important to remember is, you heard reference before to the Trump administration pulling the guidance on transgender students. Well, in some institutions, in some parts of the country, where institutional leaders or politicians were not willing to protect transgender students, that guidance allowed caring educators to say, guess what, we have to. And that just went away. Well, that's deregulation. Is that really a good thing? If you read the Trump administration's proposals on work study, they criticize where the money goes. And actually a lot of people, Democrats and Republicans, have had questions about the formulas used for work study. I found it ironic as I was reading it because I thought to myself, this is basically an argument for good regulation. And so it's not, now, particularly in your areas, no doubt you are flooded with paperwork, in many cases that seems irrelevant, or is because of a desire to protect against unscrupulous institutions that wouldn't be members of AACRAO. So there is a lot of excess regulation. But if you think you're about to see that all go away, I've got a bridge to sell you.
Let's talk a little bit about the leadership at the Department of Education. Just to put it in perspective, the administration needs to fill a total of 553 Senate confirmed positions. They were month 4.5 into this, starting 5, right? They've confirmed 18 so far, 18. Within the Department of Education, there's 55 Senate confirmed positions that need to be filled. They've done 1. That's the secretary. So right now it's a department that doesn't have anybody at the helm, right? Anybody leading the ship. So today, we heard 2 new nominees for the department. Carlos Muñiz for the General Counsel Office and Candace Jackson for Assistant Secretary of Civil Rights. What can you tell us about these 2 individuals?
So in terms of the apparent nominee for General Counsel, the main thing that I know about him is that he worked with Jeb Bush. But I think that was likely to be more influential in terms of the Secretary's school choice agenda than anything in higher ed. I haven't seen much on higher ed. On the potential OCR nominee, there is a big debate going on that you heard reference to before on whether the Dear Colleague letter about how colleges adjudicate sexual assault complaints should be lifted. And certainly the Trump administration, in fact this was in the Republican platform, has vowed to lift it.
Deregulations.
Yes, deregulation. But this is another example. If they lift it, what will your institutions do exactly? Will you go back? What will you tell the students who have been sexually assaulted? It's not just a matter of going back in the way people think. The broader issue that I'm hearing about, and this probably more directly affects many of you, is that in the department right now, the civil servants are very nervous because they don't have political bosses with whom to check anything. And what I'm hearing from a lot of colleges is they are calling the department because an unusual situation has come up with an aid applicant or some form that a student has to fill out, and they're looking for guidance. What do I do in this situation? And generally what I'm hearing right now is that many in the department seem paralyzed and afraid to act. That's not a particularly political issue. Right. It's just the result of not having people there. It has been incredibly difficult to get answers back from the press office because there aren't enough political people there to guide things. You look at what's going on right now with the IRS tool that should be helping people file their FAFSA, and you just have a sense that people aren't doing their jobs in some way. One of the things that I have been, we were talking about earlier, I have been getting a lot of emails from college presidents, from financial aid directors saying, is this intentional? Are they intentionally shutting down this service?
Are you saying it's a conspiracy theory?
A conspiracy, yeah. Now, I believe that with the government, never assume malice when incompetence could be the answer. and I genuinely believe that's what it is. But the fact that people who are not conspiracy theorists are asking me about this conspiracy speaks to the level of distrust and the level of fear. And I think that's very unhealthy for institutions and the students they educate.
So I'm glad you mentioned the whole FAFSA and IRS, because I know that impacts nearly everybody here, right? What have you heard? What is really kind of going on? I mean, we've basically been told that now that we're not going to see, basically this is the way it's going to be till the next academic year, right? So what have you heard? Because it's, when we try to get anything from the department, it's talking to a stone wall. But.
So what I have heard is more from campuses than the department. And some campuses are reporting success at getting more people to use early and low-income students to use early, and that's what it was designed for. I've also heard anecdotal reports that the best people at filing early are wealthy students, which isn't shocking because they have access to the best advisors. So I'm hearing some fear that the biggest change and the biggest help may be to those students and families who need it the least.
We also have heard that the administration's not considering filling in a lot of the political positions that have traditionally been filled by previous administrations. The one, and as you noted, Mr. Vallis is very focused on K through 12 issues. Previous secretaries have been, their expertise have been K through 12 issues, but they brought in some folks who have been very, very knowledgeable and very well connected with the higher education community. We've heard that there's a possibility they're considering not filling in the Undersecretary for Higher Education position. Thoughts?
I have heard that as well, that they would just go with the assistant secretary. I am generally distrustful about rumors about the Trump administration because everything changes all the time, but I have heard that as well. It sort of makes sense if there is a view of a reduced role in federal policy about higher ed.
One person being responsible for the entire spectrum.
For the entire spectrum. Now, one area that they do want to deregulate is for-profit higher education, and that would fall in that area. And I do think it matters, and if you look at secretaries of education, both Arne Duncan and Margaret Spellings had primarily K-12 backgrounds before becoming education secretary. Both spent a lot of time on higher education, and I think you're right. It is because they had really smart people around them, giving them ideas and engaging them. If our current secretary is primarily focused on school choice, we may not see that. I'm still not sure. I think somebody there did a terrible job at preparing her for her confirmation hearings. And so I don't really know what she thinks. And I think it will still be a period of time. I mean, if you look at the statement she issued about historically black colleges, again, trying to be charitable, I'm going to assume that somebody put that in front of her to sign. It shouldn't have, there were so many flaws with it that we and others pointed out. But secretaries, whatever their background, need people who really know their stuff around them. And that's why this prolonged period without is troublesome.
That's an understatement. So as we, let's give a shout out to, I want to do a woohoo, AACRAO. As you know, AACRAO recently released the findings of a survey that we did with many partner associations about the decrease in international applications to the U.S. I mean, you mentioned that, you know, diversity and its impact to Canada, but in my conversations with the Hill folks, especially the Senate side, and especially, they think they get it. It's not just that, it's much more of a business issue. Let me know your thoughts about that.
So it is, I mean, as I alluded to, it is money. The non-elite colleges have come to view international undergraduates as a source of revenue. And the number of colleges that tell me that their budgets are conditioned on 10% international enrollment are a lot of them. And when you leave the elite levels, these students may not come or may not come in as large numbers or may come only if they get a discount or a scholarship. That could have a devastating effect on the finances of many institutions. The question is, though, are people willing not just to say this is a financial threat, but this is enough of a financial threat that I'm going to say we need to watch what's going on with so-called extreme vetting. The reality is, if you talk to international students, and I know many of you do, who come from certain parts of the world, extreme vetting has been the norm. If you are a Muslim student from a Muslim nation, you don't just walk in and have them say, hey, welcome, here's your visa. You go through quite a lot already, and now even more. And when people start to hear reports that it's taking too long, and then they simultaneously hear, oh, but my friend down the street got a visa to go to McGill University in Canada, that's going to have an impact, and it's going to have a big financial impact. A lot of colleges are using international students in sort of a Robin Hood way to finance paying for low-income Americans. If this continues, we're really going to be hurt. And again, I would also just really like to thank AACRAO, because typically the good data on this subject tends to be a year or two out of date. Right now, we really need it current. So thank you for that effort.
And this is for this year.
Yes.
This is not, like, that was leading up to the election, right?
Right.
So the next year could be
even worse, because you know, if you talk to people in the rest of the world, they are just stunned and don't know what to make of what's going on. I had a president of a university in Paris visit me recently, shortly after Trump tweeted that Paris was dangerous. And he was just asking me, like, what's going on? And I
well, we're asking that too.
Yeah. But he was assuming I would know why we were spreading rumors about Paris being dangerous. I assured him that most Americans would love an excuse to be in Paris. But there is just a sense around the world of not knowing what's next. If you're an international student, even if you get your visa, what happens if the rules change? Think about the current versions of the visa ban that would let you stay, but not go home to see somebody and maybe come back.
Or family issues,
Family issues, so many emergency issues. Again, it's important to remember the international students who are full-pay students have options. And we are in competition for the best international talent, and we don't yet know exactly how this will all play out.
And a stat that I heard, that this is an industry that brings in about $36 billion a year. So we're $36 billion, that's not any short chump change at all. Again, I would encourage folks to start lining up at the mics so I'll continue asking questions. Trust me, I got plenty. There's lots to talk about. But I would start lining up if you start thinking about having questions. We got about 10 minutes, and so definitely want to be able to get engaged with folks out there.
Just to give you another example of the international students, 2 weeks ago, the president of Portland State University, at a time that many university presidents are doing accepted applicant events, did a series in India So think about it, the president of a university in Portland went to India to try to tell people it was okay to come here. Meanwhile, the University of Toronto had more accepted applicant events in the United States than ever before.
So let's open it up to the audience. As you come up, please state your name and your school or your institution.
Great. My name is Amy Labat, and I'm here with Brigham Young University, Idaho. Thank you so much for the information today. You talked about partnering with other organizations to pursue the agenda and lobbying efforts that we care about. I was curious from your perspective, besides AACRAO, who are the top 3 organizations that have the greatest lobbying power in Washington, D.C. for higher education?
Go for it.
I would get in big trouble with everyone I didn't name. So so I respect all higher ed groups equally, except I most respect.
That's why I'm not answering that question.
Except I most respect the group who I'm speaking to at the time. But what I would say is, I think that different groups may have different influences right now, and Brigham Young is an interesting example. Brigham Young, among other things, because of its religious heritage, has amazing foreign language programs and international programs. Brigham Young, I think, teaches more international languages than most American universities. And so at a time that an international mission is questioned, I think Brigham Young could be an important voice. Likewise, Brigham Young could be an important voice because you may have senators and representatives who don't normally turn to AACRAO for guidance. And so I think what matters is for different groups to think about what they can bring to the table.
We're part of many coalitions, and I would say probably the one that has the most wide-ranging is kind of under the umbrella of the ACE, American Council on Education, and that kind of becomes the collective voice for the entire higher education system or the space. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Sue Hamilton from Rutgers University in New Jersey. Scott, I want to thank you for being here despite all the bad news. We'd like to hear from you anyway.
Out of chaos comes opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. I don't have a question, but I have a comment. In my institution, I share both registrar and student affairs responsibilities, and kind of in line with the previous question, what I'm hearing from my colleagues in NASPA is that in terms of the transgender issue and the Title IX sexual assault issues, we don't need regulation to do the right thing. And many of us are going to continue to do what those regulations require, even if they're abandoned. So I would encourage all of us to I think we need to advocate at our institutions to continue to do that good work.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about that, diversity. You mentioned diversity in your comments. She obviously mentioned diversity. And we are experiencing a huge, tremendous change in demographic and trends, especially in high school graduation rates, college enrollment rates, Latinos, and much higher. Sometimes it's estimated that I think that's part of the fear factor that we'll have a minority-majority population at this time. Do you think the higher education community is ready for the shift? Is preparing? Is well? How are we going to do?
So rhetorically, the higher ed community is ready for it. It talks about it a lot.
Right.
I'm not sure it's really ready for it, because if you want to think about the new students who are coming in, we need to be talking about community colleges. We need to be talking about minority-serving institutions. We need to be talking about institutions that aren't judged by the high percentage of applicants they reject. By and large, higher education glorifies the institutions that admit only 8% of applicants over the community colleges that educate everyone who comes. And I think we need to think about how we allocate resources, how we allocate attention and prestige to those institutions. Take an issue like Summer Pell. If Summer Pell to probably everyone here is like so logical. People at community colleges need it. They're not summering in Maine, they are going to class.
Right.
Unless they are at a Maine community college, I should say. Yet, this change was made and has been allowed to persist year after year. If Congress somehow did something that botched the summer internships of Ivy League graduates or Ivy League students, it would be a crisis on page 1 of the New York Times, and it would have been solved in 1 year. This affects not those who are at the Ivies who still do take their summers off, but that new majority. And so my question is, when will higher ed really put those issues front and center?
So I'm looking at the TikTok. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I thank Scott. This is a great discussion. We certainly have a lot of issues that we have to address. That's why we need everybody engaged in the public policy process. We will certainly be looking for all of you to become engaged in this. A couple quick housekeeping announcements. First, about food. Who likes food? Everybody loves food. Please join us in the exhibit hall for a refreshment break right after the session. Also, don't forget the town hall meeting this afternoon in this very room at 5:15. For those who want to know a little bit more what we're doing here in the GR office, Government Relations office, for all of you, again, these are your issues. Go and download the synthesized version of the public policy agenda that's attached to this session. Finally, I'd like to provide Scott with a token of appreciation for being with us today. Can we give him a large round of applause? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And I'd welcome cards from anybody. I'll make sure you get our news, and we'll be in touch on issues. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.